All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to webinar number 2 in our series. This one is an overview of carbon pricing toolkit and proxy price tools. I'm Shauna Weber. I'm the Director of Sustainability at Princeton University. And on behalf of the Ivy Plus and Listening Post Sustainability Initiative, I'm going to hand it over to Alex Barron and Susan Sayre from Smith College to walk us through our webinar today.
Thank you. So I'm Alex Barron. I'm an assistant professor in the Environmental Science and Policy program here. I was one of the voices on the first webinar, and I'm now joined by my colleague, Susan Sayre.
Yeah, I'm Susan Sayre. I'm an associate professor in the economics department. I was listening in the background, but today I'm going to be participating, going through our spreadsheet.
Great. So, moment, there we go. So the goal today is to really give everyone on the call a sense of what a proxy carbon price implemented on campus looks like in practice. So I'm going to talk a little bit, just review, because it was a couple weeks since the last webinar about what the general steps to implement a carbon price might look like, in particular in the context of aggregating some data for a big study. Then I'll talk very briefly about the toolkit for internal carbon pricing in higher education, which is another resource that you can use to get more information here. And then we'll pivot, and Susan will introduce the Smith College Lifecycle Cost Tool, which is designed to do a lot of this work for you. And I'll come in at the end and talk a little bit about how that tool might be adapted for your institution. And just as a reminder, the overall goal in this conversation in the long run is to develop a cohort of schools interested in facilitating research in this area by piloting the use of this tool for maybe about 2 years. So if you, sorry. So if you wanted to have a proxy carbon price on campus, one of the first decisions you would have to make is what level that price should be set at. For the purposes of today's discussion, we're going to assume that the default is just the price that Smith uses, which is already in the tool. I'll talk about where that price comes from a little bit later on. Then the second thing you need is a spreadsheet tool that can help facilitate these kinds of analyses in a uniform way. So we're going to spend the bulk of the webinar talking about that tool and just get you oriented to what that really looks like. Then you have to define some designated parties to lead the work. This is, on most campuses, usually facilities in collaboration with sustainability staff. So for example, sustainability staff might lead the effort in adapting the tool to the institution in conversation with facilities, and then facilities might be directly working with a vendor who's doing some kind of analysis with it. And then, as we've mentioned in the last webinar, the actual analysis could be done by consultants, staff, interns, students, classes, faculty. That's quite flexible. So once you have that framework in place, then our thinking is that you would apply the tool to as many decisions as make sense. Ideally, this would be decisions that you're already making about retrofits or new construction on campus, fleet purchases, those kinds of things. And because these are processes that are already running, you can often sort of build this into the RFP without adding too much burden to or cost to the existing process. We also encourage campuses to have classes and faculty experimenting with the tool if there's more exotic or creative implementations they want to explore. And then in order to really get the maximum bang for the buck, the idea here is that folks would share the data back to us, and we'd be able to look at the picture across institutions and see if we can draw some additional insights by being able to compare schools. And that would include helping us to understand what worked in practice and what didn't work, either with the tool, thinking about the carbon price, decisions it might or might not have tipped, those kinds of things. So one of the other resources for thinking about these kinds of efforts is the Internal Carbon Pricing in Higher Education Toolkit. You can see the URL here. If you haven't checked it out, I highly recommend it. It was developed by the schools and institutions that you see here back in 2018, with the explicit idea that schools should not have to reinvent the wheel here if they're thinking about internal carbon pricing. And we launched this last September at the Global Climate Action Summit. And it's a work in progress. It reflects the schools who had materials that they could bring at the time. We have at least one more case study that will be added probably before the fall. And as other schools develop practice in this area, we're hoping to get everybody on the toolkit in the long run. So if you go to the Toolkit website, you'll see these 6 large categories. And I'm not going to cover all of them because you can go to the website and look through them, but I just wanted to let you know where a few little bits of information are located. So if you go to item 4, which is case studies, this is where you can find little 1- or 2-page summaries of some of the other institutions that have internal carbon pricing approaches on campus. Swarthmore has a proxy carbon price, so that's the other sort of most relevant example that's located there. But if you're looking for names or examples from other schools, that's a really great place to look. If you go to item 6, program management tools, then this is where a lot of the tools we'll be talking about today are located. So there's an older version of our proxy carbon lifecycle calculator. Before this effort would get underway in a big way, we'd put a newer version up on the website, but it's similar enough to the old version that you could download that now and play with it, and it'll look similar to what we're talking about today. And then also on there is a document to walk you through step by step to adapting this tool to your institution. I developed this with one of my undergraduate research students, so it's calibrated at about that level that you could hire an intern into an office and that they would be able to work with facility staff and others to get the numbers in the tool, and then a guide on how to use the tool. And these are living documents, so if you have suggestions for improvements, please let us know and we'll shoot you updates. And then the last thing I wanted to flag is that there is a frequently asked questions field on the website. And you can go right on there if you want to and request answers to other questions that you might have. So you can bring us questions, or if you think that this is a question that would really, a lot of people would want to know the answer to, you can ask us. Put it up on the toolkit. So I think that's everything I have to say about that. Any quick questions about the toolkit before we get into the actual tool? All right. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Susan.
Thanks, Alex. So I've been, this is Susan Sayre again, and I've been recently leading the refining this tool. As Alex said, this was actually originally developed by an undergrad that we were working together with on an honors thesis. And it's based on an adapted version of the tool that Harvard was using, but we've made some changes to try to make it easier to use and to apply to our context a little bit better. As you can see, it's a spreadsheet tool that lives in Excel. And what I'm going to do today is try to walk you through how you would actually use this project on a specific, or how you would use this tool on a specific project. Then at the end, I'm going to hand it back to Alex, and he'll talk a little bit about how you would adapt it for your school. So I'm going to sort of start from the it's been adapted for your school baseline. But before we dig into the details of the actual tool, the first thing you want to do is make sure that this tool is actually appropriate for the project you're considering. We face a little bit of a challenge between making the tool apply to lots of different situations and making it easy to use. And so we sort of set up a situation that we think covers a lot of the cases that people would want to use, and said, essentially, this tool is going to allow 4 different types of costs. So a project you're looking at can have initial upfront investment costs. It can have ongoing annual consumption of inputs like electricity, natural gas. It could also be other inputs that aren't energy related. And today I'm going to focus exclusively on those 2, but the tool does also have the ability to build in replacement of some components on a regular cycle, or some idiosyncratic labor or material expenses that might occur on specific years throughout the project. One really important thing to note, though, is that the carbon costs in the spreadsheet are only associated with the annual ongoing consumption. So if you had important carbon costs associated with the other pieces, that's something that we would either need to adapt the tool or you'd have to address in a different way. And then the final thing is that it's really important. This is a tool that assesses variation in cost. And so if the alternatives that you're comparing are providing different services in other ways than just cost and carbon emissions, the tool is not going to really be able to assess that. And so you're either going to have to do that offline in addition to the tool, or you would want to be comparing alternatives that are similar except for cost and carbon emissions. So if you have a project that meets those criteria, then what I want to do is walk you through how you would actually use the spreadsheet to analyze the project. And basically, there are 5 steps to this process. The first thing you'd want to do is identify the baseline alternative. And we highlight this because it may well be the case that your baseline alternative is not the current situation. Your baseline alternative should be essentially what you would do if you weren't engaging in this comparative analysis. Once you have that baseline, this is what I want to consider all of my alternatives in comparison to. Then you're going to go through and identify the comparison alternatives you want to consider and assemble information on the baseline and all of those alternatives. So that would be assembling information on the upfront investment cost, those ongoing periodic expenses, and the annual utility consumption. And I should emphasize that this is probably the place that's going to take the most time on any given project. And this is the place that it's project specific. So this is the place that our tool can't really help answer those questions. It can help you, once you have that information, figure out what it means. So once you've collected that information, you'll enter it into the spreadsheet tool. And then you should always make sure to set aside some time to really look at the results and try to understand what they're telling you and how that's going to inform decisions. And so the plan today is to just go through these step by step using an extended example from our own operations here at Smith. We think that this is a good way to get a sense of how this really operates in practice. And so we're going to look at our first case study of using this tool, which was looking at renovations of a dorm here on the Smith campus. And this was a dorm renovation that was going to be happening due to external factors based on some other construction projects on campus. So we knew this dorm was going to be renovated. And the question was really which energy efficiency upgrades made financial sense for us to undertake as part of that renovation. And the initial assessment of this was done by our honors student that I mentioned earlier, Brianna Parker, for her honors thesis. And I mention that because it is realistic for a student with some support on getting the inputs to do this analysis on their own. We then asked the architects, when we got to the actual scoping stage, to do a follow-up analysis using a somewhat revised version of the spreadsheet tool, which is the one I'm going to present today. So as we go through our steps, the first step for us was to identify our relevant baseline and what alternatives we wanted to compare. And this was a case where we intentionally selected the baseline not to be the current condition of the building because we knew we were going to be making some upgrades. In particular, there were things we were going to have to do to satisfy code. And we had also already decided that it made sense to install double glazed windows and an energy recovery wheel on ventilation. So we build those in as our baseline in the analysis we're going to do. And then we asked ourselves, should we do some incremental things? Should we do air sealing to reduce air changes per hour? Should we insulate the slate roof? We then analyzed those jointly to see if there were sort of differences that weren't purely additive. And then finally, we looked at the question of whether we should upgrade the double glazed windows to triple glazed windows in addition to that air sealing and insulation. So those are the alternatives you're going to see us go through in the spreadsheet today. And what we did is we asked the architects to say, okay, these are the alternatives under consideration. Can you give us information on the costs and estimated utility usage? So they gave us data that looks like this. Actually, we gave them the spreadsheet and they entered it, but I want to separate the two for the purposes of the webinar. But they gave us information on the initial costs and then the chilled water usage for cooling and the steam usage for heating. They used an energy modeling tool to give us that. You'll notice I've put double stars on one of the steam usage numbers. There's some concern that that number is perhaps an overly conservative estimate, that it might actually use less steam if we did that. But this was the information that we needed to conduct the analysis, and this is the step that on a project by project basis, assembling this table is probably the bulk of the work. Once you have it, entering it into the spreadsheet is pretty straightforward. So we'll walk through how we do that. We'll just look back at this data entry tab. All of the data that you enter on a specific project will be entered on the tab that's called the Input Tables tab. And we've used color coding to help indicate what parts of the spreadsheet you want to be editing. The green cells are the ones that apply to a specific alternative. So in what I'm going to do today, we're only going to be changing the green cells. The purple cells are the ones Alex is going to return to in a few minutes and talk about how you might adapt those for your specific institution. So for instance, one of those purple cells includes our natural gas cost and our steam cost and our estimates of emissions. We're now going to assume, this has been adapted for your school, the purple cells are all set, and we're going to go through how we're going to enter the data for our specific project. And it goes in 3 specific places. So the first thing is in the upper left, we enter basic information about the project. Then in the middle, we're going to enter descriptions of the various alternatives and their initial costs. And then down at the bottom, we're going to enter the specific energy use of the different inputs that we're going to use on an annual basis. So we'll start with the project information. We can go in and enter things like when we expect the investment to occur, when we think operations will start. It's really important if you're using the sheet to give each project a title so you can kind of refer to them. And it's also going to be really important in the pilot study to have some description, of sort of overall description of the project, right? So here I'm telling this is renovation of a 3-story brick dormitory on the Smith College campus. And I'm going to make sure to be, although my animation seems to have lost it, I'm going to make sure to be specific about the what qualifies as the baseline. Oh, I'm sorry, I got off with my slides. Apologize for that. So yeah, so now I'm going to enter some specific information here about the baseline and describe how that baseline is not the current condition because it includes the double glazed windows. So that's the first step, to describe the baseline. Then we're going to move, and you notice the spreadsheet, when you open it initially off the website, it has these 2 sort of placeholder alternatives, alternative A and alternative B. We're going to want to replace those with our specific alternatives. And so the spreadsheet has macros built into it to make sure that when we rename alternatives, it's done consistently throughout the spreadsheet and everything stays in sync. And so we'll push this little button here to rename an existing alternative, and it'll pop up a box asking us how we want to rename it. And this is my super fast animation, so you don't have to watch me type this live, but you would just go through and enter all the information for the specific alternative and do the same thing for the second placeholder alternative to get through entering all that information about those alternatives. Now the spreadsheet ships with 2 alternatives because we, in a lot of our examples, we found that that was as many as we needed. But in this case, we're going to need more alternatives. So there's also another button that we can use to add additional alternatives. And so we'll go through and add an alternative for both air sealing and insulating the roof. And we'll describe that one. Just here, we're going to say that that's going to add the air sealing to the insulation, and then we can update those costs. And I apologize for the timing being a little off. This runs differently on Alex's Macintosh computer than it does on my PC. Then we'll add our triple glazed windows example. And I want to highlight on this one, the previous projects were all insulation projects, but here we're looking at a combined group of energy efficiency. So we have a drop-down menu to point that out. And we're going to also analyze it relative to the previous alternative rather than relative to the baseline. Okay, so once we've entered all of these, this information, we can go ahead and jump to the next piece where we're going to enter all the alternative specific information. The first thing I had to do there was delete all the existing information that is sort of shipped with the baseline alternatives, and then put in the ones that are specific to this example. And that's really what you have to do to enter the data. Once you've gone through those steps, your data entry is done and you're ready to look at the results. So what I'm going to do now is walk through what the results look like on this example and talk through how you might interpret these results. The place I like to start when I'm looking at the results is the tab that's called the cost breakdown graph, and that's what you're looking at here. This is just graphing the total cost of ownership, net present value over the life of the analysis, which was 20 years in this example, what we expect it to cost us for each of these alternatives. And so the dark blue bars at the bottom are looking at the investment, and we see that all of the cases except our baseline, we have some investment costs we need to consider. Then if we look at the top of the blue bars, that's looking at sort of your traditional financial analysis that's just the investment cost and the operating cost over the life of the project. So the alternative that has the lowest light blue bar would be the one that would look best on a traditional LCC analysis. And then when we add the green bars, we're adding the carbon costs on top. And so the top of the green bar is the one that has the lowest cost, including the carbon costs. Okay, so we have our graph version of this, but we also have a detailed table with numbers, which is particularly useful when you have blue bars that look very similar in height and you can't really tell which one happens to be higher. So that's on our result comparison tab. And I'm going to take a few minutes to walk through a few of the numbers on this result comparison tab to help you understand what the different components of this are. So first at the top, we have some summary information about the emissions and the reduction in emissions across the different alternatives. And we report an annualized cost of carbon savings, of the carbon savings associated with each project. Then in the middle, we report investment metrics. And for all of the investment metrics, we compute them both with and without carbon costs. So you can have a sense of what the analysis looks like on kind of a traditional financial analysis basis and what it looks like when we include the carbon costs. And then finally, in that bottom portion, we have the actual numbers that were graphed in the previous graph. So I find it particularly useful in really understanding this to look at the concrete cases. So I'm going to start by looking at an alternative that makes financial sense independent of carbon costs, and show you how that alternative shows up in this table. So the good example here is insulating our roof. This is an alternative that's going to show a positive net present value in that circled red cell. Without proxy carbon costs. So even if we weren't considering proxy carbon costs, this analysis tells us that insulating the roof makes financial sense. Another related way of saying that is that the discounted payback period on this project is less than our analysis timeframe. So we have this set at a 20-year analysis timeframe, and this insulation would be expected to pay back in roughly 16 years. We also see that annualized cost of carbon savings is negative. This insulation would save us 27 metric tons of carbon per year. And in addition to saving that, it would be like we would also be getting this financial bonus of saving $32.50 for each of those tons that we had saved. So that's a clear financial winner project. And we can compare that to one where the proxy carbon price is gonna make a difference. So this would be an alternative that saves money only if we consider the proxy carbon costs. So in this case, we see the net present value switching from negative without proxy carbon costs to positive if we do include the proxy carbon costs. And this would be a project that has a positive but relatively low cost of carbon savings. So that's telling us that if we both air seal and insulate the roof, we can save 30 metric tons relative to the baseline at an annualized cost of $2.51 a ton. So that might be a pretty efficient way to reduce carbon. And finally, we can compare that to an alternative that doesn't save money even if we do include carbon costs. And an example here would be our triple glazed windows. So our triple glazed windows are showing a negative net present value, both with and without carbon costs. And they show a pretty high, a positive and pretty high annualized cost of those carbon savings per metric ton. So that's kind of a rough overview of how you might read this spreadsheet. One of the things that we've been doing over the last year since Brianna initially did this is trying to assess what modifications we might want to make to this sheet to make it more useful for us. And we're really open to continuing to do that based on participant needs within the constraints of our time as faculty members that have some other things, some other pulls on our time. But I just thought I would walk through one example of something that we added in the last year based on how we were using the tool, which is that we found we often needed to switch back and forth when we were thinking about a particular alternative, what the right comparison alternative was. So if you look at that last column, I said that we're going to compare our adding triple glazed windows. The comparison alternative here is we're comparing it to both air sealing and insulating the roof, not to the baseline. So we were thinking about it as an incremental, sort of an incremental investment. And when we report these numbers in this table, all of the net present value numbers and these carbon saving numbers and all of the discounted paybacks depend on what alternative you've chosen. But these numbers that I'm highlighting in yellow, the total cost of ownership and the cost breakdown, are independent of the comparison alternative. And so we can see if I change those and said, let me compare it to the baseline instead, a lot of those metrics would change. And so this was a place where we thought it would be useful for people working with this tool to be able to ask, it's the same basic data, but you can ask yourself slightly different questions with it. Okay, so there's probably a lot more we could say going into this table, and I feel like this might be a place where if people have questions during the later session, I'd be happy to go back to this table and talk through specific numbers. But I wanted to conclude by summarizing sort of big picture what Smith learned from doing this analysis. And I'm going to go back to the graph because I feel like it's the easiest way to walk through this. And so the first thing we learned is that insulating the roof in our example was a clear financial winner. I pointed that out when I said it's one that pays even without carbon costs. And we also concluded, we can see this in our graph because the green bar, both the green bar and the blue bar are lower than the baseline, their baseline counterpoints. We also concluded that our alternative of both air sealing and insulating the roof is cheaper than the baseline. However, if we look at air sealing incrementally, it's more expensive than either if we just air sealed, that's more expensive than the baseline. And if we do both, that's more expensive than just insulating the roof. So from a financial perspective, our analysis told us that air sealing might not make sense, even if we're including carbon costs. But this was an example where we looked at the data input and said, you know, we're going to air seal anyway. And we did that for a couple of reasons. One was that it has benefits from an occupant comfort perspective. So that would be a place where our alternatives are sort of yielding us very similar, but not quite exactly the same things. And then I also had said we thought that the modeled steam savings were overly conservative, and it wouldn't take a lot to tip the balance into making it make financial sense, so we decided to go ahead. And any participants in the pilot study, you would always have that option to say, here's what the spreadsheet says, but we're gonna do this instead because it makes more sense for us for whatever reason it might make more sense for you. And then finally, the last thing we learned was clearly triple glazed windows don't appear to be worth the cost, whether we compare them as an incremental option alone, sort of any way we looked at the triple glazed windows, they just seemed to be too expensive for the relatively small carbon savings they were going to deliver. So I think with that, I'm going to hand it back to Alex, who's going to take over and talk a little about how you might adapt this tool for your school.
Great, thanks, Susan. So I'm just going to run through a sort of high-level overview. There's detailed documentation on all the individual steps. One piece that, depending on how things go here, you might or might not want to change for your institution is the price. This is this is a decision that involves value judgments, and so we just always like to flag it when we talk about the tool. So the price that we use here at Smith is $70 per metric ton of CO2 equivalent. And one thing that's relatively unique to our price, there's only a handful of other schools that have this, it rises year on year. And so a project that has a lot of carbon emissions in the out years, the carbon price gets much higher out there. This price and trajectory was selected by our Committee on Sustainability, which is composed of faculty and staff and students, and based on a bunch of research that we had done in my lab. the insights from that research are in a document up on the Toolkit website. So if you wanted to have this same conversation, you don't have to start from scratch or have someone who used to work on the social cost of carbon at the federal level giving you this information. We've sort of given you a head start with the information in that document. And the reason we went with this sort of $70 a ton price, one is that it's in the range that seems consistent with a 1.5 or 2 degrees C trajectory. So the kinds of carbon reductions that are consistent with avoiding dangerous anthropogenic influence on the climate system. The second reason is that many of these estimates that schools use are inspired by what's called the social cost of carbon. This is an estimate of the damages that a ton of carbon emissions cause. And it turns out that there's not just one estimate of the social cost of carbon, and one of the most important variables there is how much weight you place on future generations. The conversation here at Smith was that we're an educational institution. We were very focused on these impacts on future generations, so a slightly higher price, what's called a lower discount rate, made sense for us. The third is that it was, even at the time when we picked it 2 years ago, in the range of the values amongst our peer institutions. So Yale uses a number around $40 a ton. Swarthmore uses a value up around 100. So we were sort of right in between those estimates. Conveniently, after we picked the number, the CEO of Royal Dutch Shell was in the media talking about what carbon price he felt was necessary to really transform the energy economies globally, and that number was $75 a ton. And then the last thing I wanted to observe is that this number is slightly more aggressive than the carbon prices that you see in many current federal proposals. So it's not a direct analog for what the impact of a federal proposal would be, but we wanted to push the envelope a little bit here and explore changes that we might make at slightly higher prices. And so it seemed appropriate for that. And the nice thing about a proxy carbon price, as I mentioned on the last webinar, is that it's not binding, so we may end up only picking a lot of decisions that make sense at $40 a ton, and we could say no to some that make sense at 70. And this whole package, as Mike Howard mentioned on the last call, from his perspective in the finance office, was a carbon price that was forward-leaning, but something that would seem reasonable when he was talking to trustees and other decision makers. Your mileage may vary. And if you want to change it, you just alter those two fields in the spreadsheet tool. So there you go. So then there's a bunch of other assumptions in the spreadsheet tool. These are those other purple cells that we were talking about. And I've grouped them into 3 big buckets just to sort of think about how you might approach them. So the first one are sort of broader national scale assumptions. Oil prices are the best example here. You're probably, if you're buying gasoline on campus, you're going to be paying the national oil price. I've put natural gas in here because that's how I usually think of it, but now that I'm talking about it, your delivery price is probably going to vary a bunch, and so you'll want to think more in a more detailed way about that. We've also done the trouble for things like oil and natural gas, working out an emissions rate that you can use in the tool, and we're not anticipating that anyone would have to go in and recalculate those numbers because they're directly linked to the fossil fuel. So those are things that you shouldn't have to change. Then there's a bunch of regional assumptions. If another small college in New England wanted to adapt our tool, there would be a bunch of numbers that they would also not have to change because the electricity prices in ISO New England are about the same. The emissions associated with purchased electricity are about the same. Your region will look different if you're in a different part of the country. And in the documentation, we have a little table that you can look in to get the emissions rate for your region of the country for purchased electricity. And then hopefully everyone has an estimate of what the electricity price is that you're currently paying and expect to pay in the future. We also expect there to be a little bit of variability in the way in which costs for materials and labor escalate over time. If people wanted to collaborate on that on a regional basis, that would be one way to set it, or you could pick an institution-specific number. And then the last numbers are the ones that are really going to come from your institution. They're going to be unique for every person or every institution. So the best example there is that if you have a campus power plant, it's going to have an emissions rate, and depending on what fuels it's burning with what efficiency, there's going to be a different emissions rate that you're going to want to use there. And as schools are moving forward, that's one area where we might want to have specific targeted conversations with institutions to help them get a handle. But this is another point where I usually like to mention that the goal here is to approximate the right number. You can still get good insights about policy design, even if you do not have the exactly right precise number, right? These considerations with carbon are better than without carbon. Life cycle costs are better than without life cycle costs. And so we're just trying to move the ball forward here in practice. And then another number that's going to vary across institutions is the discount rate that your institution likes to use in financial decision making. And so we don't know what that is for you, and you will have to put it in the spreadsheet. So those are basically the categories. Again, there's a guide on the Toolkit website that walks step by step and tells you where you can get this information. And we're happy to help along with that process. If you're looking for help, we have two big avenues that we encourage you to explore. The first is the first place to check should definitely be the documentation on the Toolkit website. When we get the new tool up there, it will have a few more pop-up comment boxes that help you fill in those fields. So that new version will help you with that. If you have fixes or features that you'd like to see added, please let us know and we'll add them to the queue for when we have the bandwidth. The other thing that it seemed like would be useful was to create a little location for a sort of community of practice around internal carbon pricing with proxy carbon prices. And this would be for the Ivy Plus Sustainability Consortium plus anyone else who reaches out to us about doing this at their school. And so if you're familiar with Slack, we built a Slack channel. It's like a little mini social media site, but instead of posting cat videos, you can post your questions about how to do this on your campus. And we're hoping that this will be a place where schools can support each other. And then we will duck in to the extent that we can to answer any questions where people really need our help to fix them, or if there's a fix to the tool or a question about how to standardize across campuses, then that'll be the place where everyone will be able to sort of go and have a big archive of all the questions that have been asked and the answers that came through. And I think we've moved through that material really briskly so that we could make sure that we had 20 minutes for questions. So we're happy to jump back to any earlier part of the presentation to help make sure that people are clear on what we're talking about here. There was already one question about how many can you compare? I'll ask Susan if there's an upper limit on how many options can be in the spreadsheet.
Well, I would say in principle, it's limited by Excel's capabilities, and there is some maximum number of columns you can add in an Excel spreadsheet. I would say in practice, the limitation is going to be more how many you can reasonably look at and keep track of. And as you add alternatives, the spreadsheet is going to slow down. Just adding more and more alternatives, Excel starts to get upset when it has too much data in it. But that's why there's that macro button to add alternatives. The default only has 3, but we tried to design it so that it would be easy for schools to add a bunch of alternatives, because we know in practice you might have 10 alternatives maybe, but there's no, outside of the limitations of Excel, there's no theoretical upper bound.